majesty. I love you, Lord, forever and ever and ever. When I get to heaven, Lord, one day, can I have a beautiful singing voice? Thank you.
In late August, while we were preparing to move by selling all of our furniture, Julia was asked to sing at a little country chapel just outside Sault Ste. Marie. She had quite a successful singing ministry and would always make herself available to sing for God, no matter when or where. During the service, helpers passed the offering plate around, and when I checked, I discovered I had a $2 bill in one pocket and a $20 bill in the other pocket. I did not want to give the $20 bill as we had not received any money from the house deal yet, and we were down to our last dollars. Julia noticed my dilemma and quickly pointed to the $20 bill. I lifted up the $2 bill and then received a sad, "You have let me down" look from her, and decided to put the $20 bill in the collection plate as it had stopped in front of me. Julia's singing was inspirational as usual, and after the service, the pastor stood up and thanked Julia for her music ministry. He told the congregation we were moving to British Columbia to serve the Lord and wanted to help us by giving all of the money collected from the offering. I felt humbled by this lesson God used to teach me, you cannot outgive God. I only wanted to give to God out of my abundance, but because of Julia, I reluctantly gave sacrificially. The ironic part of this lesson, I had made our daughter Juju memorize Luke 6:38, and yet I had failed to put this into practice for myself. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you.
Today I had a nice experience. I was taken out to get a dress. Isn't it lovely? I've received so many lovely gifts since I've been home this time. Someone asked me if I was color-coded. Really didn't know what that meant. But when they explained that it was the colors that best suit you, They said, "Have you been color-coded?" And I said, "Yes, I have." They said, "What are your best colors?" I said, "Whatever my Lord sends." I thought that was nice that the gentleman who prayed for your offering mentioned the young lady. And he's right. I want you to know that this is young blood you're looking at. It's just in an old container. If I were to choose a text with which to preface what I would like to say to you tonight, would be the words of the psalmist. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name. So often people say to me, wasn't that a terrible experience? Oh no, beloved. Have you ever thought how special it was that God took so much time to teach me the things I needed to know? If I could change anything of my life, and I can't, but if I could, I don't know of anything that I would want changed. One of the gifts that my God has given me is found in the words of Paul, "For it is given unto you," it is a gift, not only to believe on him, but also to suffer with him. I could go back to my people in New Guinea, no matter what I was going through, or they were going through. We could kneel down together and I could say to them, "Beloved, I understand. I've been there. I also have suffered that too. But let me tell you what God can do for you." I had already been up in New Guinea, was the first woman from the outside world that those people, the western half of the island, have ever seen. And I shall never forget that day after crossing 14 mountain ranges. And we came to the top of the last of the mountain ranges, and I looked down into the valley. All day the carriers had been hurrying me, and they're good psychologists. They didn't say, "Hurry up," like that. They just turned around and looked at me, and they'd say to one another, "Look at that thing back there, no legs at all on her." So I started to go the more rapidly. That's exactly what they wanted me to do. And I got to the top of the mountain, and I looked down, and I saw those people coming out of the gardens and out of houses, and they were coming up the mountainside to meet me. Someone had run ahead and said, "The woman is here." And when I got to the top and looked down and saw them and heard them yodeling to me, half of your crowd says, "Hoo!" and the other half answers, "Hoo! Hoo! Hoo!" I was so excited that I began to wave my hands at them, and I was running down the mountain side with the tears running down my cheeks, and I was singing to the top of my lungs, "I'm home, I'm home, I'm home." And for 46 years, that was home to me. We came back after the Holland had been overrun by the Germans, and they said we had to abandon our post there in the interior of New Guinea. And so we walked back down the trail and to our headquarters on the island of Celebes in Makassar. I had been there while I was waiting for the opportunity to join my husband, who was the first missionary who ever went into the heart of New Guinea. And he had lost over 60 pounds in just 18 days on that trail. We walked back down, leaving our people there. And when we got to Makassar, I began teaching again in the Bible school. I had learned the Indonesian language. It's a very beautiful language. And one day after Dr. and Mrs. Jaffrey, Dr. Jaffrey was our field chairman, they had come back from just a very short trip up to the Philippines. He had had a letter from New York headquarters to say that he should think about retiring, and I was acting as his secretary at that time. I remember the letter saying, "Retiring, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm putting on new tires and I'm rolling right ahead for the Lord." And believe me, if I know, because at my age they would like to put me out to pasture, but I put on new tires and I'm rolling right ahead for the Lord. And that man was such an example to me, a man of God who had spent over 30 years in China. And then he came down and opened the first evangelical work in Vietnam. Then he went on to the Indies. He saw the great stretch of islands and knew that there were multitudes there who had never heard. And then at the conference, my husband was chosen as the assistant to Dr. Jaffrey. So that meant we had to remain in Makassar. When Dr. Jaffrey and Margaret arrived back from a short visit up to the Philippines, that morning I turned on the radio and we heard that Pearl Harbor was being bombed. None of us, I'm sure, none of you ever realized how well prepared Japan was for war. You see, we had Japanese there in Makassar who was a barber, and almost 10 years that man had been there. We did not realize that he spoke a word of English. Everybody communicated with him in the Indonesian language. We had 2 variety stores called Kaneko, and those men had been there a similar period of time. And every Sunday we would see them on their bicycles going out in different directions. Around their necks were beautiful cameras, and they were photographing every inch of that island, especially the coastline. When we heard that they had invaded Manila, we all held our breath, and we all said to one another, well, that won't last very long. But beloved, it was not long till Hong Kong had fallen. China had already been invaded, Vietnam. They were going through Thailand, into Burma. They were moving down the peninsula of Malaya, and then into Singapore. They had those beautiful ships of war there, the Prince of Wales. They thought that could never be sunk, but they did not count on the kamikaze pilots, those that met their death by diving into ships. And then we realized it was very near us. We could even go up to the top of the mountains of the interior and see the ships coming down the Makassar Straits. All of our students that we could get shipping for from our Bible school were sent back to their islands. Those that could not get back, we made a camp for them. And then I went out into the storehouse and I took up my 5 drums of wedding presents, and I just laid them aside and knew that probably I would never, ever be able to use them. We took just some kerosene, some rice, and other items of food, some soap. And with just a few things, we went on up into the mountains to get away from the shock troops. We had heard the stories of what had happened when the shock troops moved in to terrify the people. And we remembered listening to Manila, the broadcast, that young man that was talking, and he was telling about what was happening there. And he said, I think this will be my last broadcast. He said, they are bombing the city of Manila. And you could hear the sound of the bombs exploding. And suddenly he cried, I must go. And he screamed out, come on, America. And you could hear the sob in his voice, and the radio went dead. When we were in the mountains, we were about 60 kilometers from the coast. We had there a conference place. We could accommodate quite a few people at one time. But Dr. Jaffrey and Mrs. Jaffrey had built a house there. Miss Marsh, one of the Britishers, had also built a house. And so we divided up, and we were staying in these 2 houses. We were in the midst of the Bugis people. Now, they were the pirates of the islands. They were feared by other people because they built beautiful prows. Their boats could skim through the water, and they looted and plundered other ships. And we knew that they were there and very much aware of the fact that Japan was nearing the island of Celebes. They had caught 4 Dutchmen just down over the mountain from us. And those men had been knifed to death. And they were running, the Bugis people were running away when the Dutch police finally caught them. They were covered with blood. And when they went to find the other Dutch people, they had been badly brutalized by these Bugis people. There was a woman whom I later learned to know who was trying to get up to an area just 5 kilometers further inland from us at a village called Manila. Most of the Dutch people were there. And this woman had in her bag just her identification papers, and she did not have money. And out of the jungle came a group of these Bugis people. They wanted that bag thinking that it contained money. And when she held onto it, one of them ripped out his machete and almost severed her hand from her wrists, and she, of course, let go. They tied it up, her girls with her. She had four daughters, and they finally made their way up to Manila. Those were the kind of people among whom we were living. We knew that if the war lasted very long, we were going to have some gardens, so we began immediately to plant some gardens. We listened to our radio. We went to the top of the mountain again. We saw the Battle of the Makassar Straits taking place, and we knew that within a matter of just days, the Japanese would be landing on the island. There was a Dutch police officer who came to our place on a Wednesday, just before the landing of the Japanese. And he said, "We have one ship down on the south coast lying at anchor. We're going to evacuate all the women and children that want to go and all the foreigners." And when Dr. Jaffrey heard this, he said, "We will pray about it." And the man went away saying, "I will be back with a truck on Friday to pick you up." Dr. Jaffrey was a wise man. He said, "I don't want you to talk with one another about this. I want you to go to your knees and you wait on God and you see what the Lord would say to you. So that if you go, you will know that it is God who has directed you to leave. But if you stay, no matter what happens in the months and maybe years ahead, you will know that you are exactly where God wanted you to be." We came together on the Friday. There was not one person among us that felt we should leave. And so the truck stopped. Dr. Jaffrey said, "We have chosen to remain." We heard through our radio that that ship had been torpedoed 3 days out, and as far as we know, there were no survivors. So in the years that lay ahead of me, I knew that I was right where God wanted me to be. We heard through the grapevine some of our national workers, some of the natives who were bringing food to us. They would come during the night hours and bring us food, and they said they have landed not where the fortifications were, but down on the beach of Borombong. Not a shot was fired. They began to kill indiscriminately people just to terrorize the natives. And then we waited, and we knew that it would not be long before they arrived in the interior. One day I looked up from the garden and I saw Japanese soldiers coming. They were the kind that were off the ships, and they wore the tennis shoes with the great toe separated from the rest of the toes so that they could climb the ropes of the ships. When they came to the first house, Mr. Presswood was sitting outside, and he turned and he put his hands up, as anyone would do, a token of surrender. And the moment he put his hands up, they took their bayonets and they began to slash at his arms because they didn't want him to put his hands up. But Mr. Presswood didn't know that. And he was a very tall man, and they despised tall people. I have seen them jump up to slap people on the face that were taller than they were. And then he came over to the house where we were staying. And of course, they said, come over and join the rest of them. And they had their bayonets fixed on their gun. And I tell you, that's a great persuader. We hurried. We got there. The one officer slouched down in the chair, threw his leg over the side, and he proceeded to tell us that we were now prisoners of the Imperial Japanese Army, that we were going to be imprisoned right there on the hillside, that if we ever were caught outside of the premises, that we would be shot on sight, that we were to have no contact with any of the natives, that we were to remain there until they came back again and told us what they were going to do with us. Dr. Jaffrey was asked what nationality he was, and of course he was as nervous as the rest of them. He said, Canada. And the man said, where is Canada? And he did not know where Canada was, so he just dismissed Dr. Jaffrey. It was the Americans that he hated. And then he saw that Mr. Deibler had his hands folded together in front of him, and he said something to one of the soldiers, and he went over and he had his bayonet, but it was inside of the sheath, and he began to pound on my husband's hands, and he would knock them down and he would put them back up again. And finally Mr. Presswood spoke up and he said, Russell, he wants you just to put your hands down at the side. Of course it wasn't, he couldn't have told him that. And I watched and I saw how his hands were beginning to swell. And then they told us that we could go back to the other house, but never, ever were we to leave the premises there. I remember the day when it was just 2 weeks after the first time they had come, we heard the sound of the trucks. And of course, all of us immediately began to gather near the door so we could go out and not anger them. When the car pulled up in front of the house, out jumped the soldiers and 2 officers. The one officer came in, and we, of course, greeted him by bowing to him. And he said, turning to me, get some clothes for your husband. Not many. We're only going to take them down for a few days to question them. And he said, no bags. So I ran in and grabbed a pillowcase. And I picked up my husband's Bible and put that in, and then a notebook and a pen, and then the clothes that were there close at hand. And then I ran out and I was going to say goodbye to him because I saw that he'd already disappeared, so he must be on the truck. When the officer said to me, what's wrong with that old man in there? And I said, well, Dr. Jaffrey has diabetes. He was in a coma just before we came up here. He has a kidney problem. He has the beginning of Parkinson's disease. And when he heard all of the things that were wrong with Dr. Jaffrey, he just said, all right, go in and tell the old man he doesn't have to go because anybody as sick as he is will never last anyway. So I ran in and I said, Dr. Jaffrey, he said, you don't have to go. You stay with us. And I ran out then, and already they had started the trucks. And I thought I wasn't even going to be able to say goodbye to Russell. But I ran over and I grabbed hold of the back of the truck, and I handed up the little bag of things to him. And I shall never forget that day. It was Friday, the 13th of March, and I have a bit of Irish in me, but I'm not at all superstitious. I really believe that God means exactly what he says in Romans 8:28, that all things work together for good to those who love the Lord. And as I reached up there and I put my hand hanging onto the tailgate, he reached down and he took my hand and he said, remember one thing, dear. God said he would never, never leave us nor forsake us. And immediately he was taken away. I watched the truck until it was out of sight, and then I turned to go. And I thought it was one of those days when God had left me, had forsaken me. And I looked up, and there stood my Lord on the parapet of heaven. And I knew that never for a moment would I be out of his sight. I knew he would be there. I ran into Dr. Jaffrey and I said, they're gone. And then I said, that officer told me anybody who needed as much medicine as you did wasn't going to last. I said, what medicine was he talking about? And Dr. Jeffrey said, I don't know. He said, I just picked up this little black satchel that belonged to my father. He was a very wealthy man, a senator, the owner of the Globe and Mail in Toronto, Canada. And he always kept that with him. And then he said, I knew that if they took us from here, they were going to take us to the coast. And he said, you know how I like eau de cologne. He perspired freely. He just loved to put eau de cologne on there, and it was very refreshing to mop up his face with. And I looked in that bag, and he had about 6 bottles of eau de cologne. Now, Dr. Jeffrey was a very wise man. He had a birthday on the 16th of December, and so many people gave him his Christmas and his birthday gift together. So he thought he had to put an end to that. And on the 16th of January, he would say, only 11 more months till my birthday. And the 16th of February, it was only 10 more months till his birthday. And so on through the year, so none of us ever forgot his birthday. And we all knew he liked eau de cologne, so he always got a lot of eau de cologne. And I loved that, how the Lord fooled that Japanese officer. He thought that was medicine. And God knew we needed Dr. Jeffrey there with us. We were then 7 women, and Dr. Jeffrey, an elderly gentleman. We tried to protect all of our food as much as possible because we had rats. Now those houses, they looked very nice on the outside, but they were single clapboard houses, and there were many places where the rats could come in. And as the rain started, they invited all the country cousins to join them. So they all came in the house. And if you left your shoes out, you could count on it that they would have gnawed on your shoes. So we put everything into the closets, and we shoved the doors shut and made sure that there were no places where they could enter those wardrobes. Then it was getting dark in the evening, Margaret Jeffrey and I would go through that house, starting at the back, and we would look under and in everything. And every rat that was there, we would run it out into the hall, and we kept collecting them, and then we would run them into the kitchen because it was the only room in the house where you could shut the doors and shut off their exits. Then we joined them, each of us armed with a broom, and we fought those rats until we had killed every one of them. I hate rats. They would run up the walls, and they'd jump onto you, and we'd scream and yell and get them off, and we would then start working on them with the brooms. And we killed them all. I said, someday if I ever have time, I'm going to write a book on the rat and I. In my missionary life, I have had rats. We had them in the Balim that weighed 30 pounds. I have had rats in my bed. I have had them hanging on the screen, looking inside. And I said, after I had that one in my bed during the internment, that was it. They are no longer my friends or my favorite people. One night, and it must have been around midnight, and I heard noise all through that house. You know how sometimes you're just partly awake, and I could hear them. There was rustling and rumbling around there, and finally I came fully awake, and I sat up in bed, and I thought, rats. And I reached over and I shook Margaret Jaffrey's bed, and I said, Margaret, get out of bed because we must have left a lot of rats in the house. I said, I can hear them in all the rooms of the house. She got on her bathrobe, and the two of us went to the door, and when I opened the door that went into a hall, that ran the length of the house from the living room, dining room, into a bathroom at this end. Off of this hall were the bedrooms, and there was the bathroom there. And when I came out into the hall, I could see someone just rush past me in the dim light of a tiny little oil lamp that we had there for Dr. Jaffrey, who sometimes had to get up in the night hours. And I thought, what a strange way for Dr. Jaffrey to be acting. But as I came out and I looked down the hall, there stood one of those Bugis bandits. They always wore the black sarong. And he just grabbed that sarong, threw it up over his shoulders, and then he pulled out his machete, and there he stood. And I don't know why I did what I did. I'm really quite a coward. But I started down that hall after him, and I knew he looked at me so shocked, I suppose wondering what that crazy woman was going to do. And he turned and he ran, and I went right after him through that bathroom, across the porch, down over the mountainside. I don't know what I was going to do. But when I saw several others join him out of the jungle there, I stopped dead and I just said aloud, "Lord, what a stupid thing for me to do." And immediately my Lord answered me. He said, "My child, the angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him and delivereth." I went back, I reached to pull the door shut. The doorknob was gone, the lock was gone. They're very clever with their machetes. They had carved out the nicest little porthole you ever saw. By this time, Dr. Jaffrey and the rest of them were wide awake, and they wanted to know what had happened. I said, "We've had bandits in here." Yes, they'd been there. They had taken curtains, any kind of material that they could see. All the books were out on the floor, probably thinking we had hidden money in the books that were in the bookcases. But not one of the bedroom doors had been opened. I thought about that many times, and I thought whoever that was knew the layout of this house. After the war, my second husband took me back up to Bentintingi, and I went out to find a young man that I thought would have known the layout of that house. He had been a gardener for the for Dr. Jaffrey. And when I found him, I said to him, "Nomo, during the war, the big fight," I said, "Were you at the house? Did you come in the house?" And he dropped his head. He said, "Yes, Nyonya, I was there." And he said, "You know, we were having a very hard time too." I said, "But Nomo, we heard you people coming back night after night, but you never again came in the house." I said, "We had nothing with which to protect ourselves." He said, "Oh, but you had all those people in white standing guard around your house." And beloved, I believe in the angel of the Lord. I know that they encamp around about those that fear him and love him. We were almost a year in the mountain. We had to learn then to eat various kind of grasses. This one dear little woman who was a Bugis woman, but I had led her to the Lord before the war. And one day she came running in and she said, "Nyonya, I have something special for you people today." And I thought, aha, I know what it is. Because the flying ants were coming out of the holes in the ground by the hundreds. And I had seen the children out running over the mountainside catching these flying ants. And she handed a half a coconut shell to me. When I looked in it, here were little things that looked like little cheese tidbits. Of course, you don't eat the head, you don't eat the wings. You just take off the back part of the body and you drop it in coconut oil, and they were really quite delicious. I said, "I have never refused anything that my people have ever given me. Nothing. Caterpillars," my present husband says to me, "That must be like swallowing a toothbrush." I said, "Oh no, you just take a handful." Those big cocoons out of which the men make the headpiece that they have to cover their bald heads, because, you know, you can take a man out of the 20th century or you can take him out of the Stone Age and they're all the same. When the forehead begins to travel, and that's our word for getting bald, the forehead begins to travel, and when it gets back here, and it's the past complete tense, serious matter. So Adaglio Uitame goes and he gets these big cocoons. He eats the caterpillars first, then he pulls that down over his head. And then he puts pure potter's clay over it and gets the plumes of the cassowary bird and he puts those in. My, don't we think we're smart here in America with our good wigs? Why, they've had wigs out there for centuries. And they're not bad, believe me. It's just that it takes so many of those caterpillars to make a meal. But they gave us many strange and weird and wonderful things, and we ate them. There was one special seed that we liked. It looked something like millet. The more water you added to it, the more it swelled. And so we kept cooking and adding water, and then it would swell and swell and swell, and our stomachs were full. They took us from Bentintingi up to where the Dutch people were, and then they pointed across on across a valley and over on another mountainside, and they said, "You go over there." And we finally arrived after dark. And I had, Mrs. Presswood and I had sent the others ahead so that they could take their time and walk, and we came with their bags. One of the officers had said, "Here are some people that will help you," and they were my boogie's friends. I'm not sure how friendly they were, but I said to Mrs. Presswood, "Whatever you do, make like bold, like you're very brave." And so I would start from the front, and I would go down, and I would call out their number. And she would start from the back, and she would count them. And we arrived with everything. But when they finally set down the little cases that we were allowed, of clothes that we were allowed to bring, I wasn't feeling very well. And I said, "Quick, I need someplace, I'm sick." And Mrs. Jaffrey had carried with her a beautiful silver soup tureen, and she handed it to me. I filled it for her. I had to make some beds. I was glad my father had felt that a girl ought to learn to use a hammer and saw and know how to make things. We were there for several months, and I'm going to skip over this. There were many things that I completely blocked out of my mind. The thing I remember most about that time, we had had only 2 letters up until this time, knowing that our husbands were then down in Macassar. And we didn't hear anything, and the months went by. And so it was more than a year. But Mrs. Presswood and I would stand outside in the rain beating down on us, and we had an open wood fire, and we would stir that beautiful porridge, and we would sing to the top of our lungs. The song I loved most of all was, "He makes the rose the object of his love. He guides the eagle through the pathless air, and surely he remembers me. My heavenly Father watches over me." Sometimes I wondered when they came and they would loot and take anything that they saw there. And I wondered how it was that Dr. Jaffrey's flashlight and his father's watch were never taken. And I said to him one day, "What do they do when they come into that little tiny," it was just a little tiny cubicle that became his room. And I said, "How is it that they haven't gotten your flashlight?" And he said, "Lassie," because he was Scotch and I was a Macintosh. He said, "Lassie, I always put it under the pillow, and I just smooth it up, and I say, 'Lord, I need that flashlight.'" And he said, "That watch was my father's. That means much to me." And when they would walk in the room, they would reach down at the foot of the bed, and they would throw the little tiny mat up over that and look underneath, and there was nothing there. You know, while I was writing this book, I thought about that. That was 2 solid years that flashlight had gone on every time he pushed the button. He never had any batteries to change it with. He said, "No, I asked the Lord to keep it burning as long as I needed it." Then one day they came and they said, "We're going to take you somewhere else. You're living in much too much luxury here." It was ridiculous, but they watched us as we went back across the valley and then up onto the other side and into Molino, and they said, "Get into the church." And by this time, everybody was gathering in the church, everybody with a little bundle of something. I had been just within 6 months of my furlough, and I knew that my clothes would not last very long. And so I put on as many dresses as I could get on, and I did not look like a P.O.W. I looked like a nice, fat little lady. We tried to get a bench in the church for Dr. and Mrs. Jaffrey to lie on, and all the other older people on the benches. And then we slid in underneath on the cement floor. And I thought during the night, Lord, how long? And as the morning light was coming, all I could think of was, oft methinks I hear his footsteps stealing down the paths of time, and the future dark with shadows brightens with a hope sublime. He's going to come back again. And I would say, oh, Jesus, come quickly. Suddenly I heard the sound of the trucks being revved up. And so we gathered up our few things. We ran outside. It was best never to keep them waiting. We got up into this truck with a stake bed on it. And those of us who were young, and I was only 20 when I went to the mission field, and I was still in my early 20s, and I said to Margaret and Ruth that some of the younger ones, let's get where we can grab a hold of the hood of the truck. And then let's put our arms out so that we can hold these older people in there, because if we don't, they're going to throw them out of the truck. They would go around those corners. They were traveling at tremendous speeds, I think trying to throw us off of that stake bed of the truck. We finally made it down. I thought my arms would never be able to bend again. I had held them so long in that position, trying to keep those older people from falling off the back of the truck. And then we saw that they were pulling up in front of what I knew had been the native tuberculosis sanitarium. We saw that there were great long barracks made out of bamboo mat walls, with grass roofs, mud floors, double-decker bamboo racks on which we were to sleep. We found our place, and then they immediately said, no, we want all the foreigners in this one barracks, Barrack 8. And that night as we came together, all of the foreigners, we began to discuss someone to be the head of our barracks, because we were told we had to choose someone. Why they chose me, I don't know, because I was one of the youngest of the women there. I think it was probably because of my languages. I spoke Dutch fluently, I spoke English, and I also spoke the Indonesian language. And the first night I said, we are going to need the help of God in these months or years that lie ahead of us. And that night I read in their languages, and I prayed that God would protect and keep us and draw us together, and those that did not know him might come to know him as Lord and Savior. We learned later that many of the women from other camps, other barracks, would come over and sit down outside because they felt such a need and a hunger for God. And out of all of those barracks in that camp, Barrack 8 was the one that held together. And it was because of our faith in Jesus Christ. As soon as they would take some of those young boys that had reached the age of 16 to send them up to where the men were, there were Dutch people waiting to come in because they had a heart hunger after God. We had to work for the Japanese. We were their work crew. We had to make uniforms for them. The older women who could not do the heavy work outside were expected to knit white socks for the officers. And so their needles were busy all the time. All the omas, all the grandmothers. If you were cooking porridge, you were up at 4 o'clock in the morning, cooking in a large drum. It had kerosene in it. There was no way we could wash it out and get that taste out until after many, many cookings of rice for porridge in the morning. There was just above the drum in which we cooked the porridge a ledge. One night, something must have happened. We figured out later it must have been that there was a bird roosting up there, and a rat had come to get the bird. And in the struggle, they had fallen into the drum. Well, it was so dark out there you could not see. And so merrily we stirred the porridge. And when it was dished up, everybody said, "That's the best porridge we've ever had. It tastes just like chicken." But when the light of day came and we could look down into that. Here were feathers, the tail of a rat, carcasses. Some of them gave their porridge back to Mother Nature, and I decided I'd hang on to it. And I tell you, it wasn't bad. I can tell you this, that a rat is cleaner than a duck, because most of them eat seeds. Anyway, we had to, those of us who were young, we took the work, the heavy work. Some of them raised pigs for the Japanese. He would go out, our camp commander, into the villages, and he would shoot the dogs, bring them in. They had to be skinned, cut up, and cooked with the stems of the banana plants so that those pigs could have 3 hot meals a day. In would come the garbage. And of course, you always gave it the finger test. If it stuck between your fingers, it was big enough to eat. And also, I could not tell the difference between a dog's liver and calf's liver. Then we had to build roads for them. Out there in the sun, working with those great heavy hoes and building roads for them. We had to work in their coolie gang. We unloaded their trucks for them. I can remember standing on the pier down in Macassar watching the coolies come to unload the ships. And I saw that they always rolled their shoulders over and waited until that hit their shoulders, and they grabbed the ears of those big sacks. And I learned to do that. I wore a brace for several years after the war because of the injury to my spine. But you walked off with those loads or else. We also raised chickens. We had to gather up all the manure from the chickens. We had big pestles and mortars that we used. We put the chicken manure down in there, and then we'd stand with those big 6-foot pestles pounding that. And it had to be as fine as sand. Then we had to sieve it so that there would be no little lumps in there, and that was sent down for the rose gardens of the Japanese. We had to make gardens for them. We worked in the rice fields, sometimes almost up to our hips, in mud. Mud that was filthy from pigs and from water buffalo. We developed the big tropical ulcers eating into our skin. We didn't have any medicine, so we would save soap suds, and we would put our bandages in the soap suds and then put them around our legs. You never threw away a bandage. You always washed it out. And so it became a mosaic of blood and pus and dirt. To pick up the work for those that were sick in bed, that could not get out of bed any longer. They made a barracks for them. We took them out there. And those that were in the last stages of dysentery, guards were set around those beds to keep the rats off of them because they smelled death. So we had a third of our camp down. We began to pick up more and more jobs for the older ones and those that were sick, so that we would fill out the quota of work that was demanded of us. I remember a day when the priest came down from the men's camp, and with him was a new second in command. And he was a little fellow. I don't suppose that boy was much more than 15 or 16 years of age. And he had such a sweet face, we promptly named him Sweet 17. And that young man asked immediately who I was. And he would come over and he would shake hands with me. And he would find me 2 or 3 times a day, and he would come and he would bow to me. And then, because he knew it was our custom, he would shake hands with me. And he would greet me, and finally he scared me. I didn't know why he was coming to me in particular. So I asked the other women, please, to watch, and when they saw him coming, just to let me know so that I could get out of the way. But somehow he always seemed to find me. All he did was greet me. And the Catholic priest was there, and everybody was trying to get a chance to talk to him. He had been brought down to butcher those pigs so that they could be sent down, already slaughtered, to the coast, to Makassar. I thought many times, I'm going over and I'm going to ask him about Russell. And then I would see so many other women crowded around him, women that didn't know the Lord, women that were very anxious about their families. Anxious, yes. I was concerned about my husband, but the Lord would say, not now, not now. And so I waited, and a month went by after he'd been there, and still there were always people around him. I would say, Lord, I'm going over and see him now, and he would say, not now, my child, not now. And then one day, about 3 months after he had arrived in our camp, I saw Mrs. Yalstra, who was the Dutch woman, head over the camp under Mr. Yamaji, the Japanese camp commander. She came over to the door of our barrack, and she said, Mevrouw Deibler, I would like to speak to you. And so we walked out onto a grassy plot there in front of the little place where we had our meals. And we began to talk about the work. And I said, I know, I understand, but I have several other young women. And I said, I am young and we can pick up more jobs, I'm sure we can, for other people, even of other barracks. And suddenly she stopped and she said, but I didn't come to talk to you about the work. She said, I came over to tell you that your husband up in Pari Pari has been very ill. And then I saw tears in her eyes. And I reached out and I grabbed her shoulders. I said, Mrs. Yalstra, you don't mean he's gone? She said, yes. Some 3 months ago, he died in the camp in Pari Pari. I was like every young person. I loved him. I was waiting for the day when the war would be over and we could go back to our people in New Guinea. It was just like all my hopes were shattered and gone. And I just turned from her and I started to walk away. And I said, God. And immediately he answered me. He said, my child, did I not say to you that when thou passest through the waters, I would be with you, and through the floods, they not overflow you? He said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. I said, Lord, there's so much sorrow in this camp. I'm just asking one thing of you. Help me not to make my sorrow other people's sorrow. I said, just help me to dry my tears. Oh, the nights when I lay on that rack up there, the tears would flow. I learned that there is a peace that cometh after sorrow, of hopes that are surrendered, not of hopes fulfilled. A peace that looketh not upon tomorrow, but only on a tempest that is stilled. A peace not now enjoys except nor in that happy life of love secure. It's a peace that comes from conflicts won while learning to endure. Beloved, it's not the peace that over Eden brooded, that untried peace, but it's that triumphed in Gethsemane when my Lord said, not my will, but thine be done. God never allows anything in your life but what is for your good and His glory. Just remember that, won't you? I can remember the days when, if you just mentioned the shock troops, it sent terrible fear into your heart. But then there came a time when we learned to fear another group much more than the shock troops. They were called the Kempeitai, the secret police of the Japanese. Some of our women were taken away. Some of them never returned, but those that did return never talked about what happened to them. And then I remember the day when that big black limousine, we called it the death wagon, it came up and it stopped in front of the headquarters. And they called for Miss Kemp and Miss Seeley, the only two other Americans in that camp. There was an American woman who came from another island. But we were the ones, the only three that were Americans that spoke the Indonesian language and were known by the people there. And that day when they took Miss Kemp and Miss Seeley away, we all turned around and looked at one another, and we asked why were they taking them. And we waited, and we prayed, and they did not return. 1 week went by, 2 weeks went by. And then one day the whisper went through the whole camp, as it always did, Kempeitai, Kempeitai. The secret police are coming. And that day as I ran out front so I could see Miss Kemp and Miss Seeley were getting out of the car. And when I saw that there were soldiers and officers getting out of that car and running up into the headquarters office, I knew in my heart they had come for me. And so I started over toward the office because I did not want to keep them waiting. And just then, Sweet 17 came down out of the office. And he said, "Yes, they're coming for you. Come quickly." When I walked up into the office, they were walking around me and laughing. There was only one word that I understood, and that was America. Languages have come easily to me. I spoke 7 languages, and I did not understand what they were saying. I had certain commands I had to give in Japanese, and I just closed my ears to it because it was better for you not to know the language. And when those men walked around laughing, America, one of them stopped and he put down something in front of me. And I looked down at that piece of paper and I saw my name written on it, Darlene Deibler. He said, you are Darlene Deibler Rose. I said, "Yes, sir, I am Darlene Deibler," but I didn't write that. He said, "I didn't ask if you wrote it." But he said, "What do you know about Morse code?" And he began to tap out messages on that desk to me. I didn't know Morse code. I didn't know what he was tapping out. So I didn't respond. I said, "Sir, I do not know Morse code." He said, "Go over and get another dress. Come back." He said, "We're going to take you somewhere else to intern you." I ran over and I grabbed a dress which had a full circular skirt. Why I had put that dress on that day, I don't know. But I had another one. And so I grabbed that and I grabbed my Bible off of the top rack where I'd been sleeping. And then I ran back so that I could get into the car. They ushered me in with 2 soldiers, one on either side. They had their bayonets fixed on the gun. And the 2 officers were up front with the chauffeur. When we came down to the city of Makassar, I recognized the building into which they were going to go into the driveway. And I saw that they had made a jail out of it. And there just in front of me, as we pulled up, I saw Miss Kemp, a woman who had weighed about 170 pounds, and in just 2 weeks that woman looked like she was skin and bone. She was hanging on to the bars and shaking her head at me. and I saw her arms were all black and blue. And when I stepped out of that car, I just cried out to the Lord, Lord, you took Russell. Must I now go through this? And so sweetly my Lord answered me. He said, my child, whom I love, they are the ones that I chasten, I discipline. I said, all right, Lord, but please help me to be a good soldier. And those were the last words that Dr. Jaffrey ever said to me when he was being taken away from our camp. I ran up to the back of the truck, and he was being taken to the men's camp, and I looked up at him and I said, goodbye, Dr. Jaffrey. And he leaned down and he put his hand over mine and patted it. He said, Lassie, whatever you do, be a good soldier for Jesus Christ. And I said, Lord, I don't know what's going to happen to me here, but please make me to be a good soldier. I said, if ever I come out of this place, and if any of my fellow Americans ever hear about what happened to me here, I don't want them to be ashamed of me. The first thing they grabbed away was my Bible. They said, you don't need that, and you are not going to have it. You just sit in that cell and you would read that book and not think about your evil deeds against the Imperial Japanese Army. They grabbed the other dress, and I handed it then as they were trying to grab it. And I said to the girl there behind the desk, I said, would you see that Miss Kemp gets this? Because she hadn't even had time to get a dress or anything except for the work suit that she was wearing. And as I walked out through that cell block, there was a man behind me with his bayonet on the gun. And when you feel the prick of that bayonet, you move. And I was moving to try to keep ahead of him. Went across a courtyard. And then there was another big cell block there. And I saw the guard point this way. And I turned and I went along that cell block. He came to a cell that had been completely boarded up, window, so that no one could see who was in that one. And then he stopped at that one. And I looked up and I read on the door, Orang ini musti mati, this person must die. And I knew I was in death row. I could hear Miss Seeley, and I knew that within 2 weeks, that woman was a raving maniac. And when he opened the door and shoved me and I hit the other wall and I turned around and I came back and I dropped on my knees in front of the door because I wanted to watch that key. I knew when it made a complete revolution, I was locked in death row. As I sat there and I saw that man pull the key out, start to walk away, I suddenly realized I was sitting on the floor and I was singing. Do you know what I was singing? A song I learned as a little girl in Sunday school. Fear not, little flock, whatever your lot. He enters all rooms, the doors being shut. He never forsakes, he never is gone. So count on his presence from darkness till dawn. And I knew that they could not lock my Lord out of that cell, even when they locked me in. I don't know if you'll understand it, but that little cell became a sanctuary to me because my God was there with me. That afternoon, they threw a plate of rice across the floor to me. It was in a tin plate with no spoon, nothing to eat it with, but I'd learned well from the Indonesians. I knew how to get a bit of rice and roll it into a ball, stick it down there, and with your thumb you go like that right into your mouth. But I couldn't eat. When he picked it up, he said, "So, you don't like sugar?" And there was a little bit of sugar in the top of it. He said, "You'll never get it again." And no, I didn't. And they left me there in that cell about 48 hours without allowing me to go out and relieve myself. I prayed and I suffered. I knew that if I did anything on the floor of that cell, that I might be like some of the others. You have to eat it up off the floor. It wasn't until The next day in the late afternoon, they finally took me out to where there was a toilet. And I looked at the door. It was shut, but I could see fecal matter oozing out from under that door. And when I reached to open the door, it just gushed out. And I said, Lord, I have all these ulcers on my leg, and if I step into that, it'll be almost to my knees. And I saw a young man run up to the officer who was watching me to see what I would do. And the young man said, I will get water for you, sir. I will wash that down for you. And he just nodded to him in that way. And so he ran. I can't tell you how many buckets of water that young man carried. And I know that he knew who I was, till he finally had it cleaned out. And then I was taken back. And they realized that I had dysentery. I had had dysentery. I knew that, but somebody had to pick up the extra work. And those of us who were still on our feet, we tried to do the other things that our sick people could not do. When they found out that I had dysentery, they didn't bring me any rice, the dry rice. I saw the first day when he tossed that across the floor to me, and the only opening or light came through the little transom above the door. And I reached down, and I thought in the dim light in the cell, that beautiful white stuff on the top. Oh, and I clapped my hands, and I said, Lord, there's somebody out there that knows I just love grated coconut. But then when I picked it up and the light from the transom fell on it, I realized it wasn't coconut. It was full of worms. I started to push the worms up onto the side of the plate, but because there was nothing but an open tin that they had brought into my cell, and I had dysentery, and hundreds of these big blue bottle flies were in the cell with me all the time. And they left the bucket there, and they came, and they were sitting on my rice. And they were eating those worms, and I was trying to get rid of them. And I kept going like that, but you can't handle rice porridge. And it was just rice that had not been washed. It was dirty. There was no salt in it, because I also had beriberi, which is a form of dropsy. And my legs were swelling. And they knew that I had the dysentery, so that's why they put me on rice porridge. And as I was pushing those worms up on there, I decided if those flies can eat that, so can I. And I never took another worm out of there. And I could bow my head and thank God that I had that bit of rice porridge and perhaps a bit of protein as well. And I would eat it and say, thank you, Lord. I could be here without anything. Yes, I went to the hearings. I asked the Lord to help me never to cry before them. No matter what they did, I never shed a tear before them. Oh, they knew how to use judo chops on you. I thought many times he was going to break my neck. And then with his finger, he would flick me right between my eyes. Didn't realize that was such a sensitive place. The doctor said there are many nerves there. And my eyes became black and blue. And I would answer their questions that I know I did not have a radio. No, sir, I did not go into the jungle. I have never reported to any of the Allies anything about troop movements. I don't know anything about them. I don't know anything about your planes. I have never had contact with anybody from the native sector. No, sir, I did not have a radio. What did you do with the radio? I said, sir, I never had a radio. No matter what you said, they wouldn't believe you. The man that was just out of my line of vision would make the questions, and this fellow would turn them into the Indonesian language, and he would shoot them at me. And I'd say, sir, I am innocent. I did not spy on the Japanese. I have never been outside of that camp. I don't know anything about it, your soldiers. I don't know anything about where you have your encampments. It didn't make any difference what you said. Even though they tried to brainwash you and they beat you and other things, I never shed a tear. But I'll be honest with you tonight. When I got back to that cell, and the guard would lock the door, and I knew he was gone, he couldn't hear me, I wept literally buckets of tears. I cried and I said, please, Jesus, I can't go through another one. Please, Lord, no more, no more. I can't do it. And always he would say to me, but my child, my grace is sufficient for you. I didn't know why I had felt I had to memorize a poem by Annie Johnson Flint. 2 of our missionaries had set it to music. When the Lord would say, listen, my child, my grace is sufficient for you, I would sit up in the cell, and I'd take that skirt of my dress, and I would wipe up all the tears, lest the guard come back and find them. Then I would begin to sing, He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added affliction he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials, his multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance and our strength is failed ere the day's half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving is only begun. His love has no limit. His grace has no measure. His power has no boundary known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus, he giveth and giveth and giveth again. And I could go through another one and another one, till finally I knew I was to be executed. They told me that I was to be executed as an American spy. I had continually lost weight. I had malaria now. One day I needed some air, and I climbed up the bars of the window. I was glad that I'd had gymnastics and swimming. I had strong arms, and I pulled myself up the bars till I could reach the transom above the door. The minute I got up there and I was waiting for the air to strike my face, I looked down and there was a knife on the ledge. I dropped to the floor and I was shaking. I said, Lord, I think they've planted that there. They're going to try to make out that I've had contact with somebody to have gotten that knife. I don't know where it came from, Lord. And then I got my dress and I went and I wiped off all my fingerprints everywhere that I could find. And I sat down on the floor, and oh, the fear that came over me because I knew somebody had put that knife there. And I said, Lord, if they find it, they will say they have evidence against me that somebody was getting a knife to me. For 3 days I prayed, and I prayed that God would remove that knife somehow. And I said, Lord, if you could make that axe head to swim, if you could lift that iron up out of that water until it surfaced to the top, I said, Lord, it's nothing for you to remove that knife, Lord, before they find it. 3 days I waited and I prayed, and I said, Lord, you can take it away. And I went up. I pulled myself up the bars of the window, and I had not left my room in all those days. And I looked there. The knife was gone. Do you believe he is who he said he was? I do. I had become very, very ill. When I came out of that cell, I weighed 60 pounds. This one day, I was having a fever again, the malaria, and I would shake with the chills, and then the terrible fever would come over me, and it was cerebral malaria that usually is fatal. And this day I said, Lord, I really need some air. So I pulled myself up until I got hold of the bars of the window. And then I looked out and I saw that the guard was coming. He was bringing the native women who were there for just minor misdemeanors. And there was Miss Kemp also. Oh, she looked so terrible. And I was watching them. And suddenly I realized that there was something about one woman that was with the group. Every time the guard with his gun on his arm went in that direction, this woman would scurry off in the other direction. And I watched her, and I looked down there, and I thought, there she goes, and there he goes. Oh, he's coming back now. Here she's standing there as though she hadn't been doing anything. And he clicked his heels down here, and then he went off in that direction again. And I watched her, and there she was. She was headed for that fence at the end of the courtyard. And I thought, if she wants to go over by the fence, why didn't she just go over there by the fence? But no, this time he went back, and when she got to the fence, I saw a hand come through that fence, and on that hand was a whole bunch of bananas. And she put it in under her sarong, and she walked away, and nobody knew she had those bananas, but I did. I could smell bananas. I could remember the flavor of bananas. And I looked at those bananas when he passed them over. They had disappeared now, and I just dropped down off of that door, and I got on my knees, and I said, Lord, I'm not asking you for a whole bunch like she has. I just want one banana, Lord. Then I began to figure out how God could get a banana into that cell to me. Don't tell me you haven't done it. Try to figure out how God could answer your prayer. And I said, Lord, now there are 4 possibilities. These are the 2 men, Lord, that have been trying me. Neither one of those men would ever bring me a banana. I know that. And this is that guard that's on duty in the daytime, and I know he wouldn't. He wouldn't bring me a banana. And I said, then there is this older Indonesian man that comes at night to guard. I think he might even bring me a banana, but Lord, please, you mustn't ask him. If he were caught bringing a banana to me, they'd just shoot him. So I said, Lord, please don't even let him think about bringing me a banana, will you? And I said, Lord, there's no way you could ever get a banana into this cell to me. And I said, please don't think that I'm not grateful. I really am grateful for the rice porridge. I just saw that banana and I thought I wanted one. The next day, I heard officers coming. Often when ships were in, you were put out on display before these men. And I said, Lord, I really need strength to stand on my feet so that when I get out there, I can make a proper bow to them. And I said, Lord, help me to bow low enough so that they won't hit me across the back with their canes, which they always carried. When that door of the cell opened, I looked, and in the door stood our Japanese camp commander from that other camp from which I had been brought down to the prison. And he was smiling. And the months had gone by, and this was the first time I'd ever seen a smile on anyone's face. I was so thrilled to see that man, to see that smile on his face, and I just clapped my hands and I said, oh, Tuan Yamaji, seperti lihat sobat yang lama, Mr. Yamaji, it's like seeing a friend. And I saw the big tears come in his eyes, and he turned and walked right back out of the cell without a word. And he began to talk to those 2 men who had been trying me. And I saw their heads getting lower and lower as he talked and talked. I don't really know what he said, but I've always felt that what he was telling them was what I had said to him the day when I heard that Russell had been gone for 3 months. The late afternoon, Mr. Yamaji called me over to his office, and he said, "Nyonya, this is war." I said, "Yes, sir, I understand that." He said, "What you heard this afternoon, many women in Japan have heard." I said, "I understand that, sir." He said, "You're very young, and someday the war really will be over. And you can go back to America, and you can go dancing and go to the theaters, and you can forget all about these awful days. You can marry again." And I said, "Sir, may I have permission to speak to you?" You never spoke to them without first asking permission, or they just instinctively threw up their hand and smacked you across the mouth. I said, "May I have permission to speak to you?" And he motioned for me to sit down at a desk. At his desk, there was a chair there, and he went around and sat down behind it. I said, "I would like to tell you about someone that perhaps you don't even know. And I didn't learn about him until I was 9 years old, back in Boone, Iowa in America." And I said, "His name is Jesus. He's the Son of God, the Creator, who created all things." I said, "That's why I don't sorrow like people that have no hope. I know that someday I will see Russell again." And I said, "Mr. Yamaji, I don't know. Maybe you have never heard about Jesus, so I would like to tell you about him." I said, "That's why I don't hate you, Mr. Yamaji, because where the love of Jesus is, there's no room for hatred." And I said, "My Lord gave his life for you too, and God gave me the most beautiful opportunity to lay a plan of salvation before that man. And as I talked to him, I saw the tears start down over his cheeks. And I said, 'He loves you, Mr. Yamaji.' I said, 'Maybe God brought me here just for you. I don't know. But if you were to believe, it would be worth everything that it's cost me.'" He got up, couldn't control his tears anymore, and he went into his room. I could hear him crying and blowing his nose in there. I only know this, that from that moment on, that man was my friend. He made me head over the whole camp toward the end after the bombings. I think that's what he was telling those men, because they became very quiet and their heads went down. I didn't know at the time, but these men had been up to the camp and told Mr. Yamaji and the women that I was never to be returned to the camp because I was dying of tuberculosis, they said, not wanting them to know that I was to be beheaded. Mr. Yamaji came back into the cell, and he looked down at me and he said, "Oh, you are very ill, aren't you?" And I said, "Sir, I am." He said, "I'm going back to the camp now, and I just wanted to know if there was any word you had for the women. Everybody's asking about where you are, what's happened to you." And I said, "Mr. Yamaji, when you go back, would you tell those women that I am all right? And they will understand, and I think, Mr. Yamaji, you will understand, I'm all right because I'm still trusting in the Lord." He nodded to me, he turned, he walked out of the cell, the door was locked, and as soon as I heard them going, I remembered I hadn't bowed to those Kempetai men. Oh, the fear that came over me, and I said, "God, please, why didn't you help me to remember?" Because just as soon as Mr. Yamaji's gone, that guard's going to come back here and he's going to get me and he's going to take me back to the hearing room, and please, God, I don't want to go back there anymore. And then I heard the guard coming. So I stood up and I said, "Lord, once more, please, help me not to shed any tears." The door opened and in walked the guard. And he just laid them all out on the floor in front of me. He said, "They're all yours. They're all from Mr. Yamaji. You know what they were, don't you?" They were bananas. I don't know how you would feel, but never in my walk with my Lord have I felt such shame before him. And I just pushed him over in the corner. After counting them, there were 92 bananas. And I said, Lord, I don't have any right to eat those. I said, yesterday I was telling you, here they are, 4 people, and that's all. And there's no way you could get a banana in here to me. And I said, Lord, look what you've done. I said, it's almost 100-fold. So sweetly the Lord said to me, but my child, that's the way I delight to do things, the exceeding abundant, above anything you ask or think. Then I wanted to eat them all at once. I knew I didn't dare to, because I knew that I would be eating it off the floor again if I did. And I said, Lord, I don't have much character, but would you just help me to not eat any more bananas than my body can assimilate at each time. And one day, I was very ill, and I hardly had the strength to get up off the floor. And I would crawl over, and I would get the bananas. They were black now, and I'd take 1, and then 2, and then I would leave it. And I sat there realizing that if they didn't behead me, that I probably would die anyway of starvation. I was that sick. And all of a sudden, I heard the most beautiful singing. It was like an angel chorus. And somebody was singing outside. And it was singing in the Indonesian language because it's so beautiful there. Oh, how sweet the name of Jesus. It's like a refuge in time of trouble. And my heart just swelled when I heard those words. And I said, Lord, I'm still under the shadow of your wings. And I climbed up to the transom above the door, and I thought, whoever that is out there, I would like to see their face. I would like to hear them singing. And when I got up there and I leaned out and I looked in every direction, there was no one there except a guard and the girl from the desk, and they were talking and laughing. They weren't hearing that singing. And suddenly great awe came over me. I got down off the door. I said, Lord, that was an angel singing, wasn't it? The voice went on. It sang to me until my heart thrilled with his presence. I was telling this to Dr. A.W. Tozer. I don't know if you know him. He was a great man of God. He said to me, girl, did you ever think that was an angel? I said, yes, I did. There was no one there, and yet that voice was singing to me. One day the Lord began to speak to me from 3 phrases of a verse that says, who delivered from so great a death. Who delivered and doth deliver, he will yet deliver. And I said, Lord, I know you've delivered me from the law of sin and death. I know that I belong to you. And up to this moment you have kept me. And he would go right back to the beginning and say, who delivered and doth deliver, he will yet deliver. And I said, God, how could you get me out of this place? And God was trying to make me to know. That day when I picked up the last banana and I peeled it, here came the guard and he said, quickly, we're going to take you somewhere else. And when we started out in that car to go back to the camp, we would have had to have turned left, and we didn't. We went right to the Gestapo headquarters. We spoke of it as the Gestapo because it was patterned after the German Gestapo. We went right to the headquarters. We were taken into a room. Miss Kemp and Miss Seeley were told to sign and write out and sign a paper how grateful they were to the Imperial Japanese Army for being so kind to them and for having forgiven them, and because they were going to release them. And Margaret was so shaky she couldn't write, and she turned to me and she said, "Darlene, would you write this for us?" Many thanks for being so kind to us and for forgiving us, and went on to say that they were grateful to the Imperial Japanese Army for their goodness. And then the two of them had to put their thumbprint on it. And then the man came over to me. They were taken into the other part of the headquarters building, and I was there where the executions took place. He walked up in front of me, the brains of the team, and he held out this big sheaf of papers, all the things that he had written. He went through them. He said I was guilty of having had a radio, that I had been in contact with the Allies. I'd reported on troop movements, that I knew where the Allies were and the Japanese, and that I had been giving all of this information to their enemy. And then he looked at me and he said, "You have done those things whereof you're worthy of death," and drew his finger across his throat and grabbed his sword at his side, and he began to pull it out. And while that sword was coming out, my heart was singing, "I'll live for him who died for me." And I said, "Lord, that's a strange song when I'm going to die." And just as he was beginning to pull that out of there, I suddenly heard sound of vehicles, of all kinds of vehicles, running up to the front of that building, honking their horns, screeching their brakes, and they ran into the building. It was ceramic tile on the floor. They wore the high jack boots with the leather heels, and they were running back and forth and yelling for this man. And he shoved that back down into the sheath, and then he ran into the headquarters. And they were talking in there at the top of their lungs. And I stood there and waited. Somebody said, "Why didn't you run away?" "Where would you run to? There's no place to run." And I stood there quietly waiting for him to come back to finish the execution. And suddenly he came and he grabbed a hold of my arm. He took me out and put me into a car, and soldiers jumped in behind me. He jumped in. And then he put 2 bottles of wine, and he said, "When you get back, you give those to Mr. Yamaji." We were going like we were top secret material. I don't know what happened that day. I only know that when we lost all of our men, and others of those godly missionaries died, somehow in the providence of God, he spared me. And I vowed that day, for any days that were ever left to me, they were all his. When we got back to the camp and we were just to cross the moat and go in the gate, that man behind me, who was the brains of this team that had been trying me, he reached up and my arm was just the bone with skin drawn over it. He grabbed my arm and I was sure he was going to break it. I bit my lip trying to keep from screaming. It hurt so bad as he twisted it. He said, "If you ever tell anybody anything that's happened to you, I'll be back and I will get you." And oh, the fear that came over me, thinking I wasn't free of them. When we got there, I just motioned for someone to come. "Please take Miss Kemp and Miss Seeley." They put Miss Kemp in the hospital. She weighed in at 90 pounds. And Miss Seeley was so bad that she was beginning to run away and do terrible things. And so they took her down and put her in a little shed that had bars in front of it so that she couldn't get out, and they locked the door on her. And I started back. Nobody seemed to even have the courage to come and say, "We're glad you're back." And I looked at them. As soon as I got around the bend so that nobody from the office could see, Ruth Presswood put her arm around me and she took me in. And I saw that her mirror was hanging there. And I looked in it and I said, "Ruth, my hair." It was white. She just nodded and the tears started down over her cheeks. When they weighed me, I weighed 60 pounds. I had just left her, and all of a sudden, Here came a woman who had been a prostitute for the Japanese. Everybody feared her. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with her. And there she was, and she motioned for me to come out into the little dining area. And here she had a washcloth, and I saw my name embroidered on it. And she said, I was down in prison too, and your Indonesian friend, Visha, was in the cell with me. And she said, I asked her if she wanted to send anything to you. And so she made this for you, and there was my name embroidered on it. And I knew she was trying to trick me. And I remembered the words of that man, if you ever have contact with anybody outside of this camp, I'll get you the next time. And I said, Mrs. Klaus, I am not going to take that. She said, you have to take it. I said, no, I don't have to take that. I'm not going to take that. I said, they told me I could have nothing to do with anybody outside. I said, you're trying to trick me. She was so angry with me. She was absolutely white. And so she was screaming at me. She said, I risked my life, she said, to bring that to you. Mrs. Presswood heard her. She came out. She said, what's the matter, Darlene? And I started to cry. I said, she's trying to trick me. She's brought this. She's trying to make it appear that I had contact with Visha. And Mrs. Presswood reached over and grabbed her arm. She said, if I ever see you near her again, I don't know what I'm going to do to you. And fear came on me, fear that I was going to be taken back again. And days I would go out and I would work, and I'd come home. And I didn't dare to sleep. I was afraid I was going to lose my mind, and I would go to the hospital. Margaret Kemp's memory was gone. And I would go down, and I asked if I could work with the chickens because I could be near Miss Seeley. And I could hear her in there, and I would go up and try to put my hands around hers and talk to her. And then I would turn away, and I'd think, God, look at these women of such faith. And who am I? I'm the youngest of all of them. And look at these women of such tremendous faith, so broken, Father. And that fear stayed with me. I didn't care to go to sleep at night. And 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, I worked. And at night, I couldn't sleep. I was afraid to. I was afraid my mind would go while I was sleeping. I would just drop off to sleep, and then I'd wake up. And I was just perspired because of the fear that was on me. And I would sit up and I'd say, Lord, I've tried to trust you. I've tried in every way I could to be a good soldier for you. And please, Lord, I can't go on any longer. And then I walked out of the barracks one morning and I said, I have no more strength, Father. I said, I've tried with everything that was within me to reach up to you. And I don't know where you are anymore. I threw up my arms and I said, I'm gone, I'm gone. It was like arms went underneath me. And I suddenly began to sing, underneath thee, oh, how precious. You have not to mount on high, but to rest upon his promise in a trustful, resting lie. And I saw it. He wanted to teach me, you can't mount up to God. Your own righteousness is like filthy rags, but rest upon your God, for underneath are always and ever the everlasting arms of God. We had had bombings every year, and we dug our own slit trenches to try to be protected in a measure from the shrapnel that came into the camp. And then one day we looked up and we saw planes coming over. And then one of them separated from the other planes, and he came down, he came right over the camp, and he dropped something. And I looked and I saw a large thing that I didn't know what it was. It turned out to be an auxiliary gasoline tank. I felt so angry because when I looked up, who was dropping this? And there was the American insignia on that plane. And I saw the pilot, and I thought, how dare you do that? Those children are out there. You could have hit some of those children. Why are you dropping that here? And I realized later that that man was trying to tell us something. 2 days later, just about noon, we heard the sound of planes, and we all ran out and we stopped. We were starved for news in all those years. We'd never had one Red Cross package, never any letters from home, never any letters or pamphlets from anywhere. We were just locked inside the barbed wire of that camp. And we looked up, and those planes were coming, double fuselage planes that were painted silver. And they were such a beautiful sight, and all of a sudden things were dropping out of those planes, and we were yelling. I was screaming, "Chocolate bars! Look at them, they're chocolate bars." And others said, "No, they're canned goods." And others said, "I think they're pamphlets." And suddenly we heard the whistling of the bombs. We knew that we were wrong. And over that little camp of just 2 acres square, they laid over 5,000 incendiary bombs. Just within moments, everything was going up in smoke. I ran to jump into the ditch, and just as my feet hit the bottom of that ditch, the Lord said to me, "You borrowed a Bible from that little Chinese woman, Mrs. Lee." I said, "That's right, Lord. I have no right to let it burn." My Bible had gone to pieces. I ran inside. I reached up on my rack. I grabbed my Bible, and I came out, and I saw then they had opened the gates, and we started to run. And we ran out of the camp. And when we got outside and across the road, here were machine guns set up and hundreds of Japanese soldiers. And they just whirled on you with their guns, with their bayonets fixed on them. And they yelled T-dur and you T-dur. You just threw yourself out prostrate in the midst of them. And they were running over the top of us, and they were firing at the planes as they went over. And so the planes just circled around and laid another layer of bombs, and then they came back and they began to machine gun us. And I dropped my head onto my arm, and I said, "God, if anybody's alive at the end of this day, it will be a miracle." And when the last of the planes were gone, the smoke had died down, everything was burned flat. I looked up, and I was alive. And I said, "God, once again I tell you, if I have any days left to me, they're all yours." And then I found Mrs. Presswood, and I said, "Let's go back and see if we can find our cans that we were eating out of, and maybe our spoons in the ashes there." When I came back to where Barrack 8 had been, and I saw on the top of the ashes, somehow nobody knew that I had my bride's book with me. I had sewn it inside of a native mat. And when that barracks had burned, the roof had fallen backwards, the bed had burned and dropped down, the mat had burned away, and somehow the fingers of the wind had just opened it at the center page. And I looked down at it, and there on that beautiful black page was the certificate written in gold ink, my marriage certificate. And I looked down at it, and I said, "Lord, that was the only thing I had left." I said, "Everything else is gone." I said, "Lord, couldn't I just have that?" And when I reached out to pick it up, the minute my fingers touched it, it disintegrated. It was completely gone. I said, "Lord, I don't have anything left. That was the only thing I had." And he said to me, "My child, that's what I want to do with you. I want to make you like pure gold, even if I have to take you through the fire 7 times. I bowed before my Lord, and I said, "All right, Lord." I saw that the woman who was head of the barracks next to me was crying, and I went over to her, and I put my arms around her, and I said, "Don't cry." She said, "But my mattress burned." And I said, "Oh, yes." I said, "Everything's burned." But I said, "We've much to thank God for. We're alive. We're still alive." She said, "But I didn't leave that little mattress. It was just a little mat in the barracks." She said, "I dragged it out and I threw it in the ditch where you always lie." And I walked over to the edge of that ditch, And I looked down into it, and there was the casing from the bomb and the ashes of the mattress right where I had been lying. I felt I was in the presence of the Almighty. I said, God, it wasn't Mrs. Lee's Bible, was it? That you wanted me to get. You wanted to get me out of that ditch, wasn't it? And I walked away and I said, God, for any days I have left, I tell you once more, I'm available. They put us in shacks. They knew that this bombing was coming, and there were shacks up there in the wilderness. And 3 days later, we had a bombing, a shrapnel bomb. And there were those that were killed, children without arms and legs, and one of the young men was from our barracks, and others whose legs had been chopped off by the force of the bomb hitting them. I remember the day when finally, at the end of August 1945, we were called out, and there was Mr. Umaji, and there were the others standing there, all in dress uniform, and they told us that there had been an announcement on the radio by the Imperial Japanese Emperor Hirohito that there was to be a cessation of all fighting. I have seen pictures of the victory celebrations in San Francisco and New York and other big cities. And I thought that wasn't the way it was that day. When they told us that they were going to make arrangements when it would be possible, they would take us down to Makassar, and then, of course, we would have to wait for the boats to come to evacuate us. And they asked if I would come, he asked if I would come, and I would take over translating, interpreting for the Japanese and the Australian and the Dutch and the Americans. And I was translating for them. The American told us that the Philippines had over 6 months been free, and why nothing was ever said to us. We were still their prisoners. And I one day walked back to the little shack up in the jungle, and I heard the sound of a man's voice, and I looked, and coming up the pathway was this young man all in white. My, he looked beautiful. He was so squeaky clean. And here we were, we'd cut off our hair because we didn't have any combs and because livestock was plentiful. And we didn't have any way to keep our hair dry, so we'd chopped our hair off very short. And I was in my work shorts and a sleeveless blouse because everything else had burned in the bombing. And I looked at that man coming, and he had shoes that were so highly polished that you could see yourself in them. And I thought, oh my, I've never seen such altogether-ness in my life. And when he got up next to me, he said, "Are you the American?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I am an American." And he just looked at me, and I know that I didn't look like any American girl he'd ever seen. I was a mess. He couldn't keep his eyes off my bare feet. And he said, "Don't you have shoes?" I said, "Oh, no." I said, "We've never had shoes, and that's all right because I like walking barefoot." He said, "I'm going to see that you get some shoes." He said, "Oh, sorry," he said, "I should have introduced myself. I'm Tom Sawyer, and I'm with the American Navy." And it was on the tip of my tongue to say, "Sure, and I'm Becky Thatcher." But I didn't know if he had a sense of humor or not, so I decided I better not. So I said, "I'm Darlene Deibler from Boone, Iowa." And so he wanted to know what I needed, and I said, "Oh, combs and soap, but most of all, we need food for the children." He said, "Can you mark out a place where I can do a free drop for you tomorrow? We'll get you food and whatever else you need." And they did. I marked it out. I went to Mr. Umaji. He gave me the white cloth in order to mark out the space on this old rice field. And that day when the friction type lid on the top of these tins. When the tin would hit the ground, that friction type lid would just blow off, and everything was pouring out of there, and the little children were screaming. They thought they were more bombs. And we tried to explain to them that those weren't bombs, that those were containing food. And I was out there with the rest of them. We were trying to get these things up, and I found a can of sweetened condensed milk that had burst when it hit the ground. And so I thought, that's a terrible thing to let that be wasted. So I pulled it out, and what was left in there, I ran it into my hand, and then I licked it off there. It was beautiful, but it wasn't long till it came back the other way. I said, it's the only time I ever enjoyed food going both ways. And then one day they said, well, we're going to take you now because the American boys have been flown out. Those boys suffered as I have seldom heard of suffering. They were beaten with iron pipes. And sometimes they said it would be 200 times, and the people would faint, and they'd pour water on them and beat them again till their bodies were like pulp. But they were flying those that had survived out to get medical aid. And they said, if you want to go, we'll take you on the last plane load. So I remember the day when I went down there with Miss Kemp. Miss Seeley, we couldn't get her to come, and so she was being put in a place where they could look after her. And that day when I stood there, all I could see in my mind's eye were two lonely crosses on a jungle hill. Under one was my husband, under the other was Dr. R.A. Jaffrey. They had taken the men on a death march, and many of them never came back. And I thought about that, and I thought, here I arrived on my first wedding anniversary, and I'm going home widowed at 26 with not a thing I can call my own. Even the clothes I have, I've borrowed. And I said, Lord, I don't think I'll ever come back to these islands again. And then I heard, as I stepped into this little boat to go out to the plane that was there anchored in the bay, I said, Lord, I hear the sound of those running feet, but I'm not going to look at them. I'm not going to turn back and look at them. And then suddenly I heard them calling, and then they began to sing, God be with you till we meet again. And I turned, and I looked, and the tears burst out. And I said, God, that's right. That's why I came to these islands. Not because I was Reverend Deibler's wife. I came here because one day, as a little girl, I stood in a missionary meeting, the closing service. I was about the second row from the back. All of the appeal was made for high school and college young people. Nobody noticed this little girl with brown hair sitting there at the back. And when we stood up, and I heard the appeal made to them, and I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I turned around and looked, and there was no one there. And I knew it was my Lord. And I just said to him, Lord, what is it? And he spoke to me, and he said, would you go anywhere for me, no matter what it costs? I was so thrilled to think that God had even noticed me. And I said to him that night, Lord Jesus, I'd go anywhere for you, no matter what it costs. And as I turned and I looked, and God broke my heart, and I called out to them, someday I will come home again to you. It took me 3 years before I passed a physical. On the way home, they took us to Balikpapan, and there they put us in the hospital. And that night, I tell you, I didn't realize what a terrible thing a bed was. That thing had a give to it, and every time in the night when I would turn, that thing was turning over, and I knew I was being thrown out or it was an earthquake. And I'd grab the sides of the bed, and I whispered to Margaret, Margaret, are you sleeping? And she said, I can't sleep. And she said, let's get out and get on the floor. I said, that's a good idea. Let's get out and we'll sleep there, and then we'll wake up and jump back into bed before all these nurses see us. And then we talked it over a little more and said, what'll we do? if they catch us on the floor. We decided we better stay in bed. They had gone out and gotten pajamas for us. They thought and I said, oh, we're used to sleeping in our clothes. They said, tonight you're not sleeping in them. And all they could find were some pajamas that belonged to these Australian troops. And they were these very tall people. And I remember putting on those trousers, and I got it right up to here. And I said, oh, I don't need this top. But I thought I won't have much movement in my arms. So I pulled it down and rolled up the legs. And then I put my arm in this one and rolled it up till I found this hand. Then I rolled this one up. And finally, we all laughed. And we were in bed. And they said, tonight you're not sleeping in your clothes. And then the next day, after we had had tea in the morning, here came a jeep. And they took us out and they said, we're taking you on the last plane load of each one of the hops between here and Manila. So then they took us up to Palawan Island, and I saw that large cemetery out there, white stones marking the place where many American boys laid down their lives. I am a patriot. I believe in America. And I'm glad that God allowed me to be born here, to learn about Him, to have a Bible. When I was a child, I had a compulsion to memorize Scripture. I memorized books of the Bible, chapters, Psalms. That didn't matter that they took my Bible away from me because it was all there, and God played it back to me. I wonder if you lost your Bible tonight, how well off would you be? You don't know when it's going to be taken away from you. Even to your hymns, I see you all with your hymn books up there in front of you. You ought to have it down here. Because God does minister to music, through music. And I remember when we got into Palawan Island, and I looked down, and we were still, had the mentality of a POW. And when I saw that white buildings, painted white, all the men in white, I said to Miss Kemp, they are not very well camouflaged. And there they were, and they were all in dress uniform. And I thought, they don't know who's coming. We're just POWs. I wonder who they really expected. But when we got up there, and there was a sidewalk up to this big dining hall, and there were men on both sides standing at attention. Boy, my heart just burst with pride seeing those boys. And then when we got inside, someone struck up the band, and they started to play Star Spangled Banner, and they unfurled that beautiful flag down in the center. I tell you, I went to pieces. I just cried and cried and cried. They'd come up and they'd pat us on the shoulder, and he said, don't cry, you're free now. And I said, I know. But there were so many times I thought I'd never see that beautiful flag. They said, don't cry, it's all right. It's all right. We're going to have dinner now. And I tried to straighten up my face, and I tried to get these closed so they looked a little better, because it was about a size 16 on a size 6 body. And I had taken a belt and tied it real tight and cinched it around, and I bloused it up over the top of it so that the hem, the bottom of the hem wasn't down about to my ankles. But when we walked in, and I saw all that white linen on the tablecloths, and they put us up at the head table, and everyone was smiling to us. And I thought, if I eat all this that's here in front of me, I'm going to be sick, but it's going to be worth it this time. And everyone was so pleased, and they just tried to do everything for us. And that night they had outside a film that they were showing, and we sat down. I don't remember anything about the film, but I remember the ice cream and the chocolates. And then the next day they were all out there ready to see us on our way. We were the last camp that was ever found. So this was the closing up of bringing the POWs in. And then we dropped down in Manila, and they said, here's a bus. I tell you, that man who drove that bus, he would have done well, the Indianapolis 500. And we just hung on to the backs and the sides of the seat to keep from being rolled into the aisle of the bus. They finally got us there, And one of the first things they did was to give us a physical, and they said, oh my. And they laid out all these vitamins that we had to take and the medicine. I said, sir, after I've eaten all those, I'm not going to need anything else. I won't have room for it. And then they said, here, you go over, we're going to see that you get a permanent. I thought, isn't that beautiful? I like doctors that write out prescriptions for a permanent. And so they got our hair fixed up, and then they brought in the boxes from the Red Cross. And the first place I wanted to find was the post office, and I went over, and I said, would you have any mail for Darlene Deibler? He looked, he said, I'm sorry, I don't. And I went back day after day, and finally he said, boy, I don't know why somebody wouldn't write to you. And I was so embarrassed I didn't go back again until the day I was to be taken out, and the ship came, the Clip Fontaine, and they had left us there for almost a month because they didn't feel we were strong enough even to go on a ship. But finally they put us on 23 days outside of San Francisco. We were supposed to dock in San Francisco. We just gone in under the Golden Gate, and I saw all those lights of San Francisco. Everybody was so excited. Oh, that beautiful city. I said, I don't care. I said, I don't know anybody out here, no one at all. I had an auntie that lived down south, but I don't know where she is. I don't even know the address. And everybody was ohing and awing. And I was feeling, Lord, what am I going to do when I get off this ship? And then I saw the lights. Oh, I said to Margaret, don't they know that a war's on? No, it is not. And I was so fascinated with lights that you had turned on everywhere. And then we were just getting ready to pull in, and suddenly the loudspeaker was turned on, and they said, we're pulling out again, because the whole harbor is full, there are no berths empty, so they're going to take you on up to Seattle, Washington, and there you will be taken off the ship. I was so glad to spend another 2 days on that ship. That was known territory. When I got off there, I hadn't had any letter from my mother and dad, and I hadn't heard from anybody. And I thought, when I get there, I don't know where I'm going. And when we finally docked, it was Navy Day. And they said, tonight we will delouse you, and then tomorrow we'll start processing you. I was glad to spend another night on that ship. And we were sleeping 3 deep in hammocks out on the deck. There were so many POWs of us. Then the next morning, I saw my friends leaving, and I saw them going down the gangplank and meeting their families and their friends out there. And I stood there at the rail, and suddenly it struck me. The reason you haven't heard from Mother and Dad is that they're gone. And I went back and I crawled in underneath of those hammocks. And I said, Lord, you took Russell. Did you have to take Mother and Daddy also? So sweetly my Lord spoke to me, and he said, my child, you can still trust me. I said, all right, Father, but I need to find a Red Cross woman. I've been looking for one all morning. And I said, I haven't seen them. And I came around the corner of the deck of the ship, and I saw a Red Cross woman, and I latched onto her, and I said, you wait a minute, now you have to help me. I said, I'm a POW. And I said, it's been over 4 years. I haven't heard anything from my father and mother. I don't know where they are, but I need money. I've got to get back to Iowa to trace anybody from the family that's alive. And she said, honey, what's your name? I said, Darlene Deibler. She said, I've been on the ship all morning looking for you. 3 telegrams, they're all from Mother and Dad. And I opened them up. Mother said, we moved out to Oakland, California in 1942. And we knew you were on the ship, and we wanted to get there in order to greet you. But when they took you on up to Seattle, we wouldn't have time to get there. And so we've sent money to the Western Union office, and you go there and you get that money, and you get a ticket on the train and come down, and we'll be here to meet you. And you call collect as soon as you can get to a telephone. I went to get my ticket first after getting the money. And I looked at everybody who was going by me on the street. And I thought, oh my, just look at their coats. It's all that real tight nap this year. And I looked down at this coat I'd gotten from the Red Cross, and I looked like a bear. It was a real long, shaggy thing. And I went back to the ship, and I asked the captain if I could borrow his razor. And he looked at me rather puzzled, and I found a secluded spot on the deck, and I gave my coat a shave. And it really looked pretty good. Then I went to the train station, and I went up to the window, and I said, "Please, sir, I would like to have a ticket for Oakland, California." He said, "My dear, don't you know a war's been on? Only Army, Navy, Air Force personnel travel." I was just ready to faint. And I said, "Sir, I'm sorry, I didn't know that." I said, "I'm a POW, and I just got here, and I'm trying to get home." "Oh," he said, "we've got lots of tickets for people like you." And I was in business again. And then I got over to a telephone, and my goodness, it wasn't one of those things that just was on the wall, and you lift up the thing, and then someone says, "Number, please." And I said, here was this round thing there, and it had numbers, and it had letters. And I was standing there, and I thought, now how am I going to use this thing? And somebody who must have known how puzzled I was, he stepped up, and he just shoved the door open a little bit, and he said, "Could I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm a POW. I don't know how to operate that thing, and I'm trying to call my folks." And he said, "What's the number?" And I said, "This is the number." And so he called. I said, "Call, collect." And so he rang it through for me. You know, I've said so many times tonight, the Lord spoke to me, and people say, "How do you know it's the Lord?" This is the best illustration I know. When I got that call went through, and I heard the receiver going up on the other end, and I heard someone say, "Hello, Darlene." I knew it was Mother. Nobody ever said my name like Mother did. I hadn't heard her voice in 8 years, but it was Mother. I said, "Hello, Mother." Then I couldn't say another thing. She so calmly told me that my brother had just gotten in from Germany in New York the night before, and he said, "Mother, did you hear anything from Darlene?" And I said, "Mm-hmm." And then she went on to tell me about my daddy and about everybody. And all I could say was, "Mm-hmm." I couldn't answer. I was crying so hard. She said, "Now, honey, you just go and you just be sure that you get on that train, and we'll be here to meet you." Somebody told me that I really needed to have a good foundation garment. Well, at that moment, I didn't have a thing to girdle. But I went and I decided I'd get something that looked decent, and I'd gotten the money from the Western Union. And then I thought, I'm going to be on that train for a day and a night, and I better have a suitcase. And so I went and got a suitcase and a purse, and I put what little money I had in there. I got on that train. I suddenly realized at Portland, Oregon, I had not told Mother and Dad what train I was coming in on. So it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and so I went out and I found a man who would take my telegram. And I didn't realize it was just sent right through. It was phoned right through. And I said, "Kill the fatted calf. Love, Darlene. I'm arriving at 9:30 tomorrow morning." And then I got back on the train, not realizing that it was being phoned directly through. And Dad said that when that telephone began to ring, Mother jumped up and she ran to the telephone. He said, all I could hear was, "What?" And then something would be repeated, and she said, "What?" And then evidently the girl laughed, and she said, "Have you not heard of the lost son, the prodigal son? The lost is found. Kill the fatted calf." She said, "Thank you," and put the receiver down quickly and ran in and shook my dad, and they laughed. She said she's all right. She hasn't lost her sense of humor. And then the next morning, when it rolled into the depot in Oakland, California, I was looking for two faces, and I finally spotted my father the time he saw me, and he was waving to me, "Darlene, Darlene." He always called me baby. He said, "Baby." And he turned and yelled, "Mother, she's here, she's here." And my father came up, and he put his arms around me, And Mother joined us. And I said, Daddy, Mother, I thought so many times I would never, ever see you again. And as I looked out over the tops of their heads, the sun broke through the clouds, those beautiful clouds. And suddenly I thought, oh, Lord, someday those clouds will part asunder, and you will be there, and I will know you. For with the eyes of my spirit, I've looked into that beautiful face. I have no regrets for any of the things that God has led me through. I wonder about you young people. I was on a field where we had more graves than live missionaries. I'll tell you this tonight, if you don't know him, you aren't going to make it. I look at young people like you, and I often think, God, if someday you just call to me and say, come on home, I wonder who's going to step into my place out there. Do you have a life to give for your Lord? He gave everything for you. I heard him call, come follow, and that was all. My gold grew dim. I rose and followed him. Wouldn't you follow if you heard him call? I don't count the cost anymore. I still say to my Lord, at night when I lie down, precious Lord, I'd still go anywhere for you. The compensations are so tremendous.